4 divine beasts. Same aesthetic, same boss designs. For years after Breath of the Wild's release, fans debated whether Nintendo had permanently abandoned the elaborate themed dungeons that defined Zelda for decades. Then, Tears of the Kingdom arrived with temples that felt distinctly different, larger, more themed, more intricate. The question now isn't whether classic dungeons are gone forever, it's whether Nintendo has found the formula to bring them back without sacrificing the open-world freedom that made the recent games revolutionary. To understand where Zelda's dungeon design is heading, looking back at what changed with Breath of the Wild reveals just how radical that departure was. Traditional Zelda dungeons followed a formula established over decades. Enter a themed environment like a fire temple or water temple, navigate interconnected rooms while solving puzzles, acquire a special item partway through that becomes essential for progression, use that item to access previously unreachable areas, collect small keys and a boss key, and culminate in a boss battle that requires mastery of the dungeon's signature item. This structure appeared in game after game, from A Link to the Past's Palace of Darkness to Twilight Princess's Arbiter's Grounds to Skyward Sword's Ancient Cistern. Breath of the Wild shattered this template. The game's 4 divine beasts, Vah Ruta, Vah Rudania, Vah Medo, and Vah Naboris, functioned as dungeons but abandoned nearly every traditional element. There were no special items to acquire because Link obtained all his key abilities at the start of the game from the Sheikah Slate. There were no small keys or boss keys to collect. The puzzles didn't involve navigating through locked doors, but instead manipulating the divine beasts themselves, rotating their bodies or tilting them to create new pathways. Each beast could be tackled in any order, and the terminals within each beast could largely be activated in any sequence. The divine beasts were also noticeably shorter than traditional dungeons. Where classic Zelda dungeons might take anywhere from 45 minutes to several hours to complete on a first playthrough, the divine beasts could be finished in 20 to 30 minutes. They shared identical interior aesthetics, the same Sheikah technology aesthetic, the same blue and orange color palette, the same architectural style, regardless of whether the beast was a camel, elephant, bird, or salamander. And the bosses, the 4 Blight Ganons, felt similar in design and tactics, lacking the personality and unique mechanics of classic Zelda bosses like Stallard, Twinrova, or Koloktos. The fan response was polarized. Some players appreciated the divine beasts as elegant puzzle boxes that respected player freedom and didn't interrupt exploration for extended periods. Others felt disappointed by what they saw as a significant step backward from the elaborate, memorable dungeons of previous games. YouTube critic Mark Brown analyzed the Divine Beasts extensively in his Boss Keys series, noting that while they offered creative freedom by allowing players to manipulate the entire structure, they sometimes failed to encourage players to build a complete mental map of the space, a hallmark of great dungeon design. The removal of small keys meant players had complete freedom but occasionally felt directionless, unsure which terminal to pursue next. The criticism centered on several key points. First, the lack of variety in aesthetics made the divine beasts blend together in memory. Players could vividly recall the forest temple's atmospheric design in Ocarina of Time, or the ship-based puzzles of Wind Waker's Tower of the Gods, but the divine beasts' similar appearances made them less distinctive. Second, the absence of combat within the divine beasts themselves felt like a missed opportunity. Aside from scattered malice eyeballs and guardians, the beasts contained no real enemy encounters until the boss fight. Traditional dungeons tested both puzzle-solving and combat skills progressively, but the divine beasts largely separated these elements. Third, the brevity and similarity of the boss fights disappointed players who remembered memorable multi-phase encounters, like the battle against Koloktos in Skyward Sword, or the tense duel with Darknut in Twilight Princess. When Tears of the Kingdom was announced, speculation immediately focused on dungeons. Would Nintendo respond to feedback and bring back more traditional dungeon design, or would they double down on the Divine Beast approach? For years before release, this remained one of the biggest question marks surrounding the game. Then, in May 2023, just days before Tears of the Kingdom launched, Nintendo published an Ask the Developer interview series that finally addressed the dungeon question directly.
In that interview, director Hidemaru Fujibayashi confirmed the team had heard fan feedback about wanting more substantial dungeons. Art director Satoru Takizawa provided crucial details, stating that the 4 divine beasts in Breath of the Wild shared similar designs, but for Tears of the Kingdom, the development team aimed for something different.
Takizawa explained that creating variety was challenging but essential, saying the new dungeons would be huge and each would carry its own regional look and feel, just like traditional Zelda games. He expressed confidence these dungeons would provide a satisfying challenge for players, while acknowledging they were certainly a challenge to develop. Technical director Takuhiro Dota emphasized that the dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom would be unique to their respective environments, promising variation in appearance and design. Fujibayashi teased specific examples, mentioning a dungeon that connects directly from Hyrule's surface, where diving from the sky straight into the dungeon would trigger an event, a new experience impossible in Breath of the Wild. When Tears of the Kingdom released, the temples delivered on these promises to varying degrees. The game features 5 main temples: the Wind Temple, Fire Temple, Water Temple, Lightning Temple, and Spirit Temple, plus Hyrule Castle functioning as an endgame dungeon. Each temple is significantly larger than the Divine Beasts and features distinctive visual design tied to its region. The Wind Temple is a massive Zonai ship frozen in ice above the Hebra region. The Fire Temple resembles an ancient Goron mining facility deep in the Elden depths. The Water Temple floats in the sky above Zora's domain, with unique gravity-defying water mechanics. The Lightning Temple is a pyramid buried beneath the Gerudo Desert, featuring light reflection puzzles. The Spirit Temple is a construct factory requiring assembly of a mechanical sage. Critically, each temple has its own aesthetic identity. The Wind Temple's icy exterior and mechanical interior feel completely different from the Fire Temple's molten cavern aesthetic or the Lightning Temple's sandstone architecture. The bosses likewise show more variety. Kolgera is a 3-part aerial dragon requiring aerial combat. Marbled Goma is a massive spider fought across multiple levels. Mukdarok controls a shark-like sludge creature. Queen Gibdo summons swarms of moths, and Seized Construct is a multi-phase mechanical battle. These encounters require different strategies and feel more distinctive than the Blight Ganons. However, the temples in Tears of the Kingdom don't fully return to traditional dungeon design. They lack maps and compasses, there are no collectible small keys or boss keys, players don't discover special items within dungeons that unlock new abilities. Instead, Link gains companion abilities from sages that enhance his existing toolkit. The temples maintain the open-ended structure, where objectives can be completed in various orders, typically involving activating 4 or 5 locks or switches to open the way to the boss. The puzzles rely heavily on Link's core abilities, Ultra Hand, Fuse, Ascend, and Recall, rather than dungeon-specific items. What the temples do successfully is strike a middle ground. They're more substantial than Divine Beasts, taking longer to complete and feeling more like proper dungeons in scope. They feature better environmental variety and storytelling, with each tied to a regional crisis and companion character. The journey to reach each temple often involves significant exploration and puzzle solving, with areas like the Rising Island chain leading to the Wind Temple or the ancient waterworks preceding the Water Temple functioning as extended dungeon-like sequences themselves. The boss battles require more creative thinking, particularly in using sage abilities effectively. Producer Eiji Onuma addressed the dungeon question in interviews surrounding Tears of the Kingdom's release, revealing Nintendo's design philosophy. In a discussion with IGN, Onuma acknowledged that the team heard fan desires for more designed dungeons, which led to their approach for Tears of the Kingdom. He explained that when making each game, the team looks back at their past and considers where they are currently with the freedom they give players. However, Onuma also expressed curiosity about why players would want to return to games where they're more limited or restricted in the types of things or ways they can play, though he acknowledged understanding the desire for nostalgia. This philosophy represents Nintendo's fundamental tension: how to honor Zelda's dungeon legacy while maintaining the open-world freedom that defined Breath of the Wild's success.
Onuma has stated in multiple interviews, including one with RTL News in 2023, that the development team doesn't concern themselves with older games when creating new titles. They focus on the future rather than trying to recreate past experiences. When asked about integrating games like Ocarina of Time into Tears of the Kingdom, Fujibayashi explained that because Tears of the Kingdom is a sequel to Breath of the Wild, they didn't think about games like Ocarina of Time during development. This forward-looking approach explains why, even with fan requests for traditional dungeons, Nintendo hasn't simply returned to the old formula. The company views the evolution from linear item-gated dungeons to open-ended temples as necessary for their current design philosophy. In a 2017 interview with Vice, Onuma discussed Breath of the Wild's dungeon design, explaining that the shrines weren't an original design decision. At first, the team planned to include more large labyrinth-style dungeons like players would expect in a Zelda title. However, they decided to include smaller shrines to strike a balance between the extremely large overworld that players explore and the goals and objectives within that world. By dotting shrines throughout the landscape, they broke up the huge world into smaller, explorable chunks. This decision came from a pure game design perspective, not from technical limitations.
The philosophical shift goes deeper than just dungeon design. Director Hidemaru Fujibayashi has a history of experimenting with dungeon concepts that dates back to his work on handheld Zelda titles. In a 2004 Nintendo Dream interview about the Minish Cap, Fujibayashi discussed his goal of making the overworld itself feel like a dungeon. Series producer Eiji Aonuma noted in that same interview that the outside world and field map can offer more multifaceted gameplay, and in the Minish Cap, the overworld map itself acts like one big dungeon. This philosophy of bringing the dungeon out into the world became the keystone of modern Zelda design. This evolution continued through games Fujibayashi directed. In Oracle of Ages, dungeon-like sequences appeared outside actual dungeons, such as the elaborate lead-up to the Skull Dungeon involving Symmetry City. These sequences were essentially as long as the dungeons themselves. When Fujibayashi directed Skyward Sword, the game's overworld regions functioned more like extended dungeon puzzles than traditional fields. Critics sometimes referred to Skyward Sword as feeling overly constrained with limited exploration. When that experimentation proved divisive, Fujibayashi changed course for Breath of the Wild, pulling from the opposite direction, making dungeons more like the overworld and littering exploration sequences with miniature challenges. Every Korok seed, side quest, and optional boss became a concentrated puzzle within a vast network of similar challenges. Understanding this design philosophy suggests where Zelda dungeons might go in future titles. Nintendo isn't likely to simply return to the lock-and-key dungeon formula of older games. Eiji Aonuma and Fujibayashi have repeatedly emphasized that they're more interested in moving forward than revisiting past approaches. However, the evolution from Divine Beasts to Tears of the Kingdom's temples shows that Nintendo does listen to fan feedback and can adjust their approach while maintaining their core principles. Future Zelda games might continue refining this middle ground approach. Dungeons could become even larger and more elaborate while still respecting player freedom. They could feature more unique mechanics specific to each dungeon, without requiring Link to obtain new inventory items, similar to how Tears of the Kingdom's temples each have distinctive puzzles and environmental features. The journey to reach dungeons could become even more dungeon-like itself, blurring the lines between overworld exploration and structured puzzle solving. Nintendo might experiment with hybrid structures that combine elements of traditional dungeons with open-world design. Imagine a dungeon where certain paths require specific combinations of Link's base abilities, creating the gated progression of classic dungeons without needing special items. Or dungeons that change configuration based on player actions, similar to how Divine Beasts could be manipulated, but with more complex and memorable results. The key would be creating that sense of progression and discovery that made classic dungeons memorable, while avoiding the feeling of restriction that Nintendo believes limits player expression. The companion abilities in Tears of the Kingdom hint at one possible direction.
Each stage provides Link with a unique power: Tilin's wind gusts, Yunobo's rolling attacks, Sidon's water shield, Riju's lightning strikes, and Mineru's construct body. These abilities function somewhat like the items players would find in traditional dungeons, except Link gains them before entering the associated temple, rather than inside it. Future games could invert this, granting Link temporary abilities within specific dungeons that enhance his puzzle-solving options without permanently adding to his inventory. This would create the item-based progression of classic dungeons while maintaining the design principle that Link starts with his core toolkit. Another possibility involves embracing the concept of dungeons as living environments rather than static puzzles. The divine beasts were creatures that could be manipulated, and some temples in Tears of the Kingdom featured dynamic elements, like the Wind Temple's moving ship or the Lightning Temple's rising structure. Future dungeons could take this further, creating spaces that react more dramatically to player actions, where solving one puzzle visibly transforms the environment in ways that open new paths and possibilities. This would maintain the freedom to approach objectives in different orders, while creating more memorable, transformative moments. The boss battles in Tears of the Kingdom demonstrate that Nintendo can create more varied and memorable encounters within their current framework. Future games could emphasize this even more, designing bosses that require specific combinations of abilities or creative uses of the environment. The multi-phase battles against bosses like Colgera and Muktarok show that epic encounters don't require the lock-and-key item progression of older games. They simply need distinctive mechanics and presentation that make them feel unique. Aesthetics play a crucial role in dungeon memorability. One of the Divine Beast's biggest weaknesses was their visual similarity. Tears of the Kingdom temples improved on this significantly, but future games could push even further. Dungeons could feature more dramatic environmental storytelling, showing evidence of their history and purpose. They could include more elaborate set pieces and cinematic moments, particularly as Nintendo's technology continues advancing. The journey to dungeons could include more varied challenges and surprises, building anticipation for what lies within. Combat integration remains an area for potential improvement. Traditional dungeons featured enemy encounters that tested players progressively, with different enemy types appearing as players ventured deeper. The Divine Beasts largely lacked enemy variety, and Tears of the Kingdom's temples feature limited combat beyond boss fights. Future dungeons could integrate combat more meaningfully while respecting player freedom, perhaps through optional combat challenges that provide rewards or alternative solutions to puzzles. This would address one criticism of recent dungeons without forcing linear enemy gauntlets. The question of whether classic Zelda dungeons are returning ultimately depends on how classic dungeons are defined. If the definition requires small keys, boss keys, obtaining special items within dungeons, and linear progression from entrance to boss, then the answer is likely no. Nintendo has moved away from that structure and shows no indication of returning to it. However, if classic dungeons mean substantial themed environments with memorable puzzles and boss battles that provide satisfying challenges, then the answer is more optimistic. Tears of the Kingdom's temples demonstrate Nintendo can create dungeons that feel more traditional in scope and design, while maintaining the open-ended philosophy of modern Zelda. The temples in Tears of the Kingdom aren't perfect recreations of classic dungeon design, but they're also not meant to be. They represent Nintendo's attempt to reconcile two competing visions: the elaborate themed dungeons that defined Zelda for decades, and the radical player freedom that made Breath of the Wild revolutionary. Whether this balance satisfies fans depends on individual preferences. Players who prioritize freedom and emergent gameplay likely appreciate the direction Nintendo has taken. Players who miss the structured progression and item-based puzzle solving of older games might find the temples still lacking compared to dungeons like the Forest Temple or Stone Tower Temple. Looking at Nintendo's statements and design evolution, future Zelda games will likely continue refining this middle ground rather than reverting to pure classic dungeon design. The development team has been consistent in explaining their philosophy. They don't want to restrict players or force them down predetermined paths. They believe the future of Zelda involves giving players more tools and freedom, not less. At the same time, they've demonstrated willingness to respond to feedback and adjust their approach, as evidenced by the improvements from divine beasts to temples. This creates an interesting dynamic for Zelda's future. Each new game becomes an opportunity for Nintendo to experiment with dungeon design, finding new ways to challenge players while respecting their freedom. The series might see dungeons that differ dramatically from both classic and modern approaches, introducing mechanics and structures that haven't been tried before. Or Nintendo might continue iterating on the temple formula, gradually adding more elements that evoke classic dungeons without fully returning to that structure. The broader gaming landscape also influences these decisions. Open-world games have proliferated since Breath of the Wild's release, many of them drawing inspiration from Nintendo's approach. If future Zelda games want to stand out in an increasingly crowded open-world market, distinctive dungeons could be a crucial differentiator. While many open-world games offer exploration and emergent gameplay, few offer the kind of elaborate, thoughtfully designed environmental puzzles that Zelda dungeons provide at their best. Leaning into this strength, creating dungeons that are unmistakably Zelda in their cleverness and craft, could help the series maintain its unique identity. There's also the question of whether Nintendo might explore different approaches in different games. The next mainline Zelda doesn't have to follow the exact template of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Nintendo could experiment with a more structured approach in one game and a completely open approach in another, much like how A Link Between Worlds allowed non-linear dungeon progression while still featuring traditional dungeon design. The series has always evolved game by game, and future installments might surprise fans by taking unexpected directions.
What remains certain is that dungeons will continue to be a topic of discussion and debate in the Zelda community. They've been central to the series' identity for so long that any change to their design generates strong reactions. The Divine Beasts sparked years of discussion about what Zelda dungeons should be. The temples and Tears of the Kingdom reignited those conversations from a different angle. Whatever form dungeons take in future Zelda games, they'll inevitably be compared to what came before, measured against both the classics of the Nintendo 64 and GameCube eras and the open-world innovations of the Switch era. For fans hoping to see classic dungeons return exactly as they remember them, the outlook is likely disappointing. Nintendo has been clear about their design philosophy and their desire to move forward rather than backward. But for fans hoping to see dungeons evolve into something that captures the spirit of classic design while embracing modern open-world principles, there's reason for optimism. The progression from divine beasts to temples shows Nintendo can respond to feedback and improve. The company's track record of innovation suggests they're not done experimenting with what dungeons can be. The Legend of Zelda has always been about exploration and discovery, about the thrill of finding secrets and solving puzzles in a world filled with mystery and adventure. Dungeons are simply one expression of those core values. Whether they look like the Water Temple from Ocarina of Time or the Lightning Temple from Tears of the Kingdom, whether they require finding special items or creatively using existing abilities, whether they follow linear paths or allow complete freedom, dungeons serve the same fundamental purpose. They challenge players to think, to explore, to experiment, and ultimately to triumph over obstacles through cleverness and skill. The question isn't really whether classic Zelda dungeons are returning, it's what form dungeons will take as the series continues evolving, and whether Nintendo can create experiences that honor the past while embracing the future. Based on the journey from Breath of the Wild to Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo is actively working to find that balance. The temples and Tears of the Kingdom aren't the end of that evolution, they're a step in an ongoing process. Future Zelda games will continue exploring what dungeons can be in an open-world context, refining and experimenting until they discover the formula that best serves their vision for the series. Whatever that formula turns out to be, one thing remains constant. Zelda dungeons will continue challenging players, frustrating them, delighting them, and ultimately giving them stories to share and memories to treasure.
Whether they're called divine beasts, temples, or something entirely new, whether they feature small keys or sage abilities, whether they require 45 minutes or 4 hours to complete, the best Zelda dungeons will always be the ones that make players feel clever for solving them, satisfied for completing them, and eager to discover what awaits in the next one. And as long as Nintendo continues creating those experiences, the debate about what makes a proper Zelda dungeon will continue, a testament to how deeply players care about this legendary series and its future.